In the spring of 1825, a marriage certificate was filed in the Beaufort County Courthouse of South Carolina that should never have existed. The document recorded the union between Margaretta van der Horst, a 42-year-old plantation widow weighing nearly 300 pounds, and a man listed only as Samuel, property of van der Horst estate. What began as Margaretta's cruel jest, a public humiliation to demonstrate her absolute power over the 89 enslaved people at Willowmere Plantation, spiraled into something far darker. Within 18 months, 3 neighboring plantations were abandoned, and 7 prominent families fled South Carolina entirely. For 160 years, the van der Horst descendants suppressed the truth, burning letters and sealing court records. Until 1985, when courthouse renovations revealed a hidden chamber of documents that exposed systematic psychological warfare so disturbing, it forces us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about antebellum slavery. Tonight, we uncover what really happened when a joke became an obsession that consumed everyone it touched. The widow's inheritance and the weight of debt. Margaretta van der Horst had not always been the woman who would shock Charleston society into silence. Born Margaretta Chisholm in 1783 to a declining Charleston merchant family, she had married Hendrik van der Horst in 1802, a union arranged to merge his plantation wealth with her family's fading social connections. The marriage had been one of convenience rather than affection, a financial transaction dressed in the language of propriety that characterized so many alliances among South Carolina's planter aristocracy. By 1824, when Hendrik died from complications of gout at the age of 53, Margaretta found herself in a position that would have terrified most women of her era. She inherited Willowmere Plantation's 2,400 acres stretching along the tidal marshes of Beaufort County, its 89 enslaved workers whose combined value exceeded $40,000, and debts totaling nearly $14,000 that Hendrik had concealed from her throughout their 22 years of marriage. The debts had accumulated through poor cotton prices, failed speculation in Charleston real estate, and Hendrik's expensive habit of maintaining appearances beyond his actual means. At 41 years old, weighing significantly more than was considered proper for a lady of her station, and possessed of a temperament that 2 decades of loveless marriage had sharpened into something caustic and cruel, Margaretta faced a choice that would define everything that followed. She could remarry quickly, surrendering control of Willowmere to whatever husband could be persuaded to assume its debts along with its assets. She could sell the plantation, settling debts and living modestly on whatever remained. Or she could attempt to manage the property herself, an option that Charleston society viewed with deep skepticism, verging on contempt. The conventional wisdom of 1824 South Carolina held that women were temperamentally unsuited to the brutal necessities of plantation management. They lacked the stomach for discipline, the mathematical precision for accounting, and the physical presence to command respect from overseers and enslaved workers alike. Margaretta's own brother-in-law, Preston van der Horst, had made his opinion clear during the reading of Hendrik's will. "A woman cannot run a plantation of this size," he had said, his tone suggesting pity rather than cruelty. "You'll need to appoint a manager or find another husband within the year." But Margaretta had spent 22 years watching Hendrik manage Willowmere, observing his methods and mistakes with the attention of someone who knew she would inherit nothing if she did not make herself valuable beyond her dowry. She understood crop rotations, commodity prices, and the mechanics of credit better than Hendrik had. She could calculate profit margins as accurately as any factor in Charleston. What she lacked was not competence but legitimacy, the social authority that came automatically to men but had to be seized and defended by women who dared to operate outside prescribed boundaries. The debts Hendrik had left could only be addressed through dramatically increased productivity. Willowmere needed to produce not just adequately, but extraordinarily. And Margaretta understood, with a clarity that would prove both brilliant and monstrous, that achieving such productivity would require innovation, not in agricultural techniques or crop selection, but in the fundamental methods of controlling human beings who had no legal right to refuse any demand made upon them. She made her decision in February of 1825. She would manage Willowmere herself, and she would employ methods that no one had attempted before. The architecture of humiliation. Samuel had been born on Willowmere Plantation in 1799, the son of two field workers who died during a yellow fever outbreak when he was 7 years old. His mother, Judith, had worked in the plantation kitchens before the fever took her. His father, whose name appears in estate records only as Big Samuel, had been one of Willowmere's most productive field hands before disease transformed him into a corpse buried in the segregated cemetery beyond the rice fields. By 1825, at 26 years old, Samuel had spent his entire life understanding the mathematics of survival within the system of slavery. An existence built on careful calculation of how to avoid the worst punishments while not working so efficiently that quotas would be raised to impossible levels. How to appear grateful for small mercies without seeming presumptuous. How to maintain dignity within a system designed to strip all dignity away. Tall, uncommonly educated through the covert teaching of Hendrik's late mother, who had believed literacy a Christian duty, despite its illegality under South Carolina law, and possessing a quiet dignity that had earned him the position of head house servant, Samuel represented something that Margaretta found both useful and intolerable. She needed his intelligence to help manage the plantation's complex operations, to serve as intermediary between her decisions and their implementation by the overseer and field workers. She resented that his competence served as a constant reminder of her own dependence on people she owned, but could not entirely control. Samuel could read and write with fluency that exceeded most poor whites in Beaufort County. He understood the household accounts well enough to notice when suppliers were overcharging, or when the overseer was inflating reports of supplies needed. He managed the other house servants with efficiency that kept the main house running smoothly, even during Hendrik's final illness. And he did all of this while maintaining the careful performance of deference that survival required, never allowing his intelligence to appear as a challenge to white authority. What happened in February of 1825 would transform that resentment into something far more calculated and destructive. Margaretta had been managing Willowmere for 3 months, long enough to understand that traditional methods of plantation management would not produce the dramatic increases in productivity she needed to address Hendrik's debts. Brutality had its limits. Push enslaved workers too hard, and they became less productive rather than more, their bodies breaking down under impossible demands. Incentives in the form of extra rations or small privileges produced only modest improvements. But Margaretta had observed something during her years of watching human beings owned as property. She had noticed that status mattered to enslaved people in ways that plantation owners rarely acknowledged. The hierarchy within enslaved communities, the difference between house servants and field workers, between skilled artisans and common laborers, carried weight beyond the practical distinctions. People would work harder, endure more, to achieve or maintain positions that carried even the illusion of elevation. What if that hunger for status could be systematically exploited? What if she could create a system where enslaved workers competed desperately for recognition, for the temporary elevation that would distinguish them from their peers? And what better way to demonstrate the absolute power she wielded than to elevate someone in the most scandalous way imaginable, creating a distinction so dramatic that every enslaved person on the plantation would understand exactly how much she controlled their existence. Samuel would become her test subject, her proof of concept for a new methodology of control, the announcement that shocked the Low Country. February 14, 1825, Margaretta von der Horst summoned her entire household staff and the enslaved population from the quarters to the main house lawn. It was mid-morning, an unusual time for such gatherings which typically occurred at dawn or dusk when work schedules made assembly easier. But Margareta had deliberately chosen a time that would maximize disruption, would signal that something extraordinary was about to occur. Standing on the veranda of the main house, dressed in deep purple silk that strained against her considerable frame, her auburn hair arranged in elaborate curls that had required 2 hours of effort from her lady's maid, Margareta surveyed the assembled crowd with an expression that combined satisfaction and contempt. 89 people stood before her, their faces showing the careful blankness that enslaved people learned to wear when whites made pronouncements that might herald either reward or punishment. Samuel stood among the house servants, his posture erect, his face composed, having no indication of what was about to be announced. Margareta had not consulted him, had not warned him, had not given him any opportunity to prepare for what would follow. The surprise was deliberate, part of the demonstration she intended to perform. "I have made a decision regarding the management of this household," Margareta began, her voice carrying across the lawn with the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "A decision that reflects my commitment to rewarding excellence and loyalty with appropriate recognition." Samuel stepped forward. The crowd parted as Samuel moved toward the veranda steps, his expression still carefully neutral, even as confusion must have been building behind his eyes. When he reached the bottom step, Margareta descended to stand beside him, an unusual breach of the physical distance that white plantation mistresses typically maintained from enslaved men. "I have decided to marry Samuel," Margareta declared, her voice calm and matter-of-fact, as if announcing a change in dinner service rather than something that violated every social boundary governing plantation society. "He has proven himself invaluable in managing household operations, and I believe this elevation reflects his exceptional service. The ceremony will take place this Saturday. You will all attend and offer your congratulations appropriately." The silence that followed was absolute. Not because anyone believed this was a genuine marriage. Such unions were legally impossible under South Carolina law, which explicitly forbade any marriage between whites and enslaved people. But because the implications of what Margareta was proposing cut to the heart of every social structure that governed plantation society. This was not a secret transgression carried out in darkness and denied in daylight, the sort of exploitation that everyone knew occurred but politely ignored. This was a public performance, a demonstration of power so absolute that it could mock the very laws and social conventions it relied upon for legitimacy. Margareta was announcing that her control over the people she owned extended beyond their labor and their bodies. She could command their participation in a collective delusion, could force them to treat her mockery of sacred institutions as if it were legitimate. Samuel's face had gone carefully blank, the expression of someone retreating behind walls built over a lifetime of surviving the arbitrary cruelty of white power. He did not speak. There was nothing safe to say. Agreement would make him complicit. Objection would be punished. Silence was the only refuge available. Around him, the other enslaved workers stood frozen, recognizing that they were being made witnesses to something that would transform life at Willowmere in ways they could not yet fully comprehend. The ceremony of degradation. The wedding took place on February 20th, 1825, in the drawing room of Willowmere's main house, a space typically reserved for entertaining Charleston society's elite families during the social season. Margareta had ordered the room prepared with the same attention to detail that would accompany a legitimate marriage ceremony. White flowers, arranged in crystal vases, candles providing soft illumination despite the afternoon hour. The best furniture arranged to create an aisle leading to the fireplace where the ceremony would be conducted. No minister of any legitimate denomination would officiate such a proceeding, so Margareta had selected one of the enslaved workers, an older man named Ezekiel, who sometimes led prayer meetings in the quarters to perform a ceremony she had written herself. Ezekiel, at 63 years old, understood exactly what was being demanded of him. He would participate in this mockery or face consequences that his age made especially terrifying. He stood before the fireplace holding a Bible that Margareta had provided, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he waited for the ceremony to begin. The enslaved population of Willowmere filled the drawing room, packed into a space never intended to hold so many bodies. House servants stood toward the front, field workers crowded toward the back, all of them forced to witness what Margareta had designed, not as a union, but as a demonstration. Several of the house servants wore their finest clothing, the Sunday garments typically reserved for church services, because Margareta had ordered them to dress as if attending a celebration. Samuel entered wearing a suit that had belonged to Hendrik, altered to fit his taller, leaner frame. The black wool coat and gray trousers were of quality that no enslaved person would normally wear, marking him immediately as elevated beyond his previous station. His face was composed into careful blankness, but those who knew him well could see the tension in his shoulders, the slight rigidity in his posture that suggested a man preparing to endure something that could not be avoided. Margareta appeared moments later, dressed in a cream silk gown decorated with lace and seed pearls, her substantial figure displayed in the sort of formal attire that would typically mark a woman's wedding day. She had styled her hair in elaborate curls adorned with small white flowers. She carried a bouquet of roses from the plantation gardens. Every detail was calculated to mock the genuine ceremony this was not. The ritual was designed not to unite two people in marriage, but to demonstrate the absolute malleability of human relationships when one person held total power over another. Ezekiel read from the ceremony Margareta had written, words that parodied traditional marriage vows while stripping them of any reciprocal obligation. Samuel was made to promise obedience, devotion, and gratitude. Margareta promised nothing except continued elevation as long as his performance proved satisfactory. "Do you take this woman as your wife, to honor and serve her all the days of your life?" Ezekiel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I do," Samuel said, the words emerging flat and empty. "And do you take this man as your husband, to elevate and reward him as you see fit?" Ezekiel asked Margareta. "I do," she replied, smiling with something that observers would later describe not as happiness but as satisfaction. The satisfaction of someone conducting an experiment whose results had not yet fully revealed themselves. When Ezekiel pronounced them married, Margareta leaned forward and kissed Samuel's cheek, a gesture that made several witnesses look away in discomfort. Then she turned to address the assembled crowd. "You will treat Samuel with the respect due to his new position," she announced. "He is no longer simply a house servant. He is my husband, and you will address him and regard him accordingly." What none of the witnesses understood that day was that Margareta's joke had a purpose far beyond simple cruelty or the exercise of arbitrary power. She was beginning an experiment in human psychology that would test how completely a person's identity could be reconstructed when hope and status were used as tools of control. The terms of the contract. In the weeks following the ceremony, Margareta began implementing what she called the terms of their marriage, a set of expectations and obligations that she explained to Samuel in private meetings that blurred the line between instruction and threat. These terms were never written down in any document that survives, but their effects became visible in the transformation of Samuel's daily existence at Willowmere. Samuel was moved from the servants' quarters, small wooden structures behind the main house where house servants lived in crowded conditions, only marginally better than the field workers' cabins, into a room on the second floor of the main house itself. Not Margareta's own bedroom, that would have been too scandalous even for her purposes, but a well-appointed guest room that had previously housed visiting family members. The room contained a proper bed with a feather mattress, a writing desk, a wardrobe filled with clothing far superior to what any enslaved person would normally possess. He was given new responsibilities that combined legitimate plantation management with the performance of being Margaretta's husband. He oversaw the household accounts, managed communications with suppliers and factors in Charleston, and supervised the other house servants in their duties. But he was also required to take meals with Margaretta, to sit beside her in the parlor during evenings, to accompany her on inspections of the plantation, always performing the role of devoted spouse rather than enslaved manager. To outside observers who heard reports of these arrangements through the network of gossip that connected South Carolina's plantation families, it seemed that Margaretta had perhaps genuinely elevated Samuel's position, had maybe even developed some twisted affection that made her disregard social propriety. Letters between Charleston families in March of 1825 speculated about whether Margaretta had lost her mind or was engaged in some elaborate scheme whose purpose remained unclear. But within Willowmere's boundaries, the reality was far more complex and considerably darker. Every privilege Margaretta granted Samuel came with explicit strings attached, obligations that bound him more tightly than chains ever could. For each evening he spent dining with her in the main house, she required public displays of affection in front of other enslaved workers. For each new piece of clothing, she demanded that he express gratitude with performances of devotion that humiliated him in front of people who had been his equals days before. She had discovered something that traditional plantation management had overlooked, that the promise of status, the illusion of partnership, could extract more complete obedience than any physical punishment. A man who was simply enslaved might maintain some core sense of self separate from his bondage. But a man who was required to pretend that his bondage was elevation, who had to perform gratitude for degradation and devotion for cruelty. That man had to participate in his own psychological destruction in ways that were far more damaging than any whip. Margaretta documented these early weeks with notes that would later form the foundation of her journal. She recorded how long it took Samuel to perform devotion convincingly, rather than mechanically. She noted which types of privileges produced the most visible transformation in his behavior. She experimented with the balance between reward and humiliation, testing how much cruelty she could deploy before the system risked collapse. By mid-March, other enslaved workers at Willowmere had begun to notice changes in Samuel that went beyond his elevated clothing and living quarters. He spoke differently, his voice taking on formality when addressing Margaretta that sounded almost genuine. He moved through the plantation with authority that seemed less like performance and more like actual belief in his new status. The man who had been Samuel was beginning to disappear, replaced by something Margaretta was constructing with systematic precision: the illusion of partnership and the price of performance. By March of 1825, Samuel's daily existence had transformed into a performance of devotion that Margaretta choreographed with meticulous cruelty. She required him to address her as "my dear wife" in front of other enslaved workers, a phrase that had to be delivered with apparent sincerity rather than mechanical repetition. She demanded public displays of affection, carefully staged scenes where he would present her with small gifts or attend to her needs with what appeared to be genuine care. For each successful performance, Margaretta rewarded him with small freedoms that felt enormous within the context of slavery. An hour to himself in the evening when he could read from Hendrick's library. Access to writing materials in his room. Better food than what was provided in the quarters. Meals taken from the main house kitchen rather than the communal pots that fed field workers. Permission to walk the plantation grounds without explicit purpose or supervision, a liberty that no other enslaved person at Willowmere possessed. But for each failure, each moment when his performance did not meet her standards of convincing devotion, she reminded him of his true status through calculated humiliations that she designed specifically to break his spirit while leaving no physical marks. She would summon him to her sitting room and speak to him as if he were any other enslaved worker, using the contemptuous tone that plantation mistresses employed when addressing property. She would assign him degrading tasks, sending him to empty chamber pots or scrub floors while other house servants watched, stripping away the elevated status she had granted him as easily as removing a coat. The most insidious aspect of Margaretta's system was how it required Samuel to internalize responsibility for these punishments. When she humiliated him, she framed it as consequence of his own inadequate performance rather than her arbitrary cruelty. "You disappoint me," she would say, her voice heavy with manufactured sadness. "I had hoped you understood what I was offering you, the opportunity to be something more than the others. But perhaps I was wrong about your capabilities." This constant oscillation between elevation and degradation, between treating him as a partner and reminding him he was property, created a psychological instability that traditional slavery did not produce. A field worker knew his status was fixed. The cruelty he faced was terrible but predictable. Samuel lived in perpetual uncertainty, never knowing from one day to the next whether he would be treated as Margaretta's husband or her slave, whether his careful performances would earn rewards or somehow fail to meet standards that shifted without warning. Other enslaved workers at Willowmere watched this dynamic with growing horror. They saw how Samuel had begun to genuinely crave Margaretta's approval, how his face would light with relief when she praised his performance, how he would sink into visible distress when she withdrew her favor. The system was working exactly as Margaretta had calculated. She was not just controlling Samuel's behavior. She was restructuring his emotional responses, making him dependent on her validation in ways that went far deeper than fear of punishment. The spreading scandal and society's response. News of Margaretta's marriage spread through South Carolina's Plantation society with the speed and devastation of a hurricane. By April, neighboring plantation owners were sending their wives away from Beaufort County, afraid that exposure to Margaretta's behavior might somehow contaminate their own households. Letters preserved in family archives reveal the depth of horror that Charleston's elite felt, not at the cruelty of what Margaretta was doing, but at her violation of racial boundaries that the entire system of slavery depended upon to maintain its legitimacy. Mrs. Elizabeth Middleton wrote to her sister in Columbia, describing Margaretta's marriage as an abomination that threatens the very foundation of Christian civilization in our state. Colonel James Barnwell, owner of the neighboring Sam's Point plantation, wrote to his factor in Charleston that the Vander Horst woman has lost all sense of propriety and decency. She parades this Negro about as if he were a legitimate spouse, forcing decent people to witness degradation that should properly occur only in the darkness if it occurs at all. Several prominent families attempted to organize a formal investigation, but they encountered an uncomfortable truth. No law explicitly forbade what Margaretta had done. The marriage was not legally valid under South Carolina statute, which explicitly prohibited unions between whites and enslaved people, so it could not be legally challenged as an actual marriage. And Samuel, being enslaved property, had no standing to complain about his treatment, regardless of how unusual that treatment might be. The legal vacuum created a situation where Margaretta's power was effectively absolute and unconstrained by the conventions that typically governed even the most brutal plantation masters. She could claim she was simply rewarding exceptional service with unusual privileges. She could frame her behavior as kindness rather than cruelty, as elevation rather than degradation. And who could contradict her? Certainly not Samuel, whose testimony would carry no legal weight. Not the other enslaved workers who understood that speaking against their mistress would bring consequences, not even neighboring plantation owners who had no legal authority to intervene in how another owner managed their property. Reverend Thomas Middleton, rector of St. Helena's Episcopal Church, attempted to address the situation through spiritual rather than legal channels. He called upon Margaretta in early April, intending to appeal to her Christian conscience. But Margaretta received him with perfect politeness. served him tea in her parlor with Samuel standing attentively nearby, and deflected every concern with arguments that revealed the fundamental powerlessness of moral authority when confronted with absolute control. She challenged the Reverend to identify which Christian doctrine she was violating by showing kindness to someone in her household. Was it not Christ's teaching to elevate the lowly? Was she not demonstrating unusual charity? Reverend Middleton left Willowmere troubled by the realization that Margaretta was operating in a moral void where normal rules simply did not apply. The scandal continued to spread, but without legal or religious authority capable of intervention. Charleston society could only whisper in horror, while Margaretta continued her experiment. The Journal of Observations, in May of 1825, Margaretta began keeping a detailed journal of what she called her marriage experiment. Written in her precise, educated hand in a leather-bound volume she kept locked in her writing desk, the journal documented Samuel's responses to different stimuli with the clinical detachment of a natural philosopher conducting agricultural research. Each entry was dated and included observations about Samuel's behavior, her interventions, and the results she observed. May 3, 1825. Subject responds most favorably to public recognition in front of other household servants. Observed genuine pleasure, not performed, when praised for efficiency in managing household accounts. This suggests authentic desire for elevation beyond mere fear of punishment. Will test limits of this attachment. May 7, 1825. Withdrew all privileges for 3 days following inadequate performance during dinner with visiting neighbors. Subject displayed visible distress, apologized repeatedly without prompting. Restoration of privileges produced gratitude that exceeded initial expectations. The cycle of removal and restoration appears more effective than consistent treatment. May 15, 1825. Subject now anticipates my needs without explicit instruction. This morning brought coffee prepared exactly as preferred without being asked. Small gesture suggests internalization of role beyond mere compliance. Progress exceeds projections. The journal revealed Margaretta's systematic approach to psychological manipulation. She was not simply cruel for cruelty's sake. She was testing a hypothesis about human plasticity, about whether a person's sense of self could be fundamentally reconstructed through careful manipulation of status and recognition. Each observation built upon previous entries, creating a documented progression of Samuel's transformation from enslaved man performing a role to someone whose identity was becoming inseparable from that performance. May 22, 1825. Interesting development. Subject expressed concern about my health following minor illness. The concern appeared authentic rather than performed, evidenced by behaviors when he believed himself unobserved, verified through household servant reports. This suggests the performance is becoming naturalized. The distinction between authentic and performed emotion is collapsing, as hypothesized. May 30, 1825. Subject now corrects other enslaved workers who fail to show proper deference to his elevated position. This enforcement of hierarchy was not requested but initiated independently. He is beginning to identify with the system rather than resist it. Remarkable plasticity of human identity when subjected to consistent manipulation of status rewards. The journal entries grew increasingly detailed as Margaretta refined her methods. She documented which types of praise produced the strongest responses. She noted how long privileges could be withdrawn before risking permanent psychological damage. She recorded the subtle ways that Samuel's language patterns changed, adopting phrases and mannerisms that mimicked white speech even when not performing for her benefit. What made the journal most disturbing was not the cruelty it documented, but the intelligence behind that cruelty. Margaretta had approached the destruction of another person's identity with scientific precision. She was creating a blueprint for psychological exploitation that could potentially be replicated by others with similar, ruthless intelligence. The journal was not a confession. It was a manual. The first death and the beginning of contagion. In June of 1825, an enslaved woman named Patience, who had worked in the Willowmere kitchens for 15 years, was found dead in her cabin, under circumstances that the plantation physician initially attributed to natural causes. Dr. Edmund Crawford, who served several plantations in Beaufort County, examined the body and recorded heart failure as the cause of death in his medical ledger. Patience had been 43 years old, which was considered advanced age for an enslaved woman subjected to lifetime hard labor. But several witnesses reported that Patience had been among those who refused to acknowledge Samuel's elevated status, who continued to treat him as a fellow enslaved worker rather than as Margaretta's husband. She had been overheard making remarks about the farce of the marriage, about how Samuel was forgetting himself and his true position. In the days before her death, Margaretta had publicly berated Patience for this disrespect, had threatened consequences for anyone who failed to properly honor the marriage. The exact nature of what happened to Patience remains unclear from surviving records. No signs of obvious violence were noted in Dr. Crawford's examination, but the timing was impossible to ignore. Patience had openly defied Margaretta's system. Patience was dead. And the message received by Willowmere's enslaved population was unmistakable. Margaretta's power extended beyond controlling their labor or their bodies. She could enforce participation in her collective delusion through methods that left no marks but achieved permanent results. Fear began spreading through Willowmere's enslaved population, a fear that went beyond the normal terror of arbitrary punishment that characterized life under slavery. Because what Margaretta was demanding was not just obedience, but participation in a collective performance. She wanted everyone on the plantation to genuinely treat her mockery of marriage as legitimate, to pretend so completely that the line between performance and reality began to blur. The women who worked in the main house began addressing Samuel as Mr. Samuel when speaking to him, a title that would normally never be applied to an enslaved man. Field workers who had known Samuel since childhood now lowered their eyes when he passed, showing deference they had never displayed before February. Even those who understood that the marriage was a cruel joke found themselves performing belief in its legitimacy, because the alternative was to risk whatever fate had befallen Patience. Margaretta noted the change in her journal with satisfaction. June 18, 1825. Patience's unfortunate passing has clarified expectations for remaining household members. Compliance with proper recognition of Samuel's status is now universal. The collective performance creates reinforcing social pressure that makes individual resistance increasingly difficult. System appears self-sustaining once critical mass of compliance is achieved. The death had accomplished exactly what Margaretta had calculated it would. It transformed her personal experiment with Samuel into a plantation-wide system of psychological control. Samuel's transformation and the loss of self. By summer of 1825, those who had known Samuel before the ceremony began to notice a fundamental change in him. The dignity and quiet strength that had defined his character seemed to be eroding, replaced by something harder to define. A hollowness that appeared in his eyes during moments when he thought no one was watching. The constant performance of devotion, the daily necessity of treating his enslavement as love and his degradation as honor, was accomplishing what Margaretta had calculated it would. It was breaking him in ways that no whip ever could. Because physical torture leaves marks that heal, that can be endured by holding on to some core sense of self separate from the pain. But what Margaretta demanded required Samuel to participate in his own psychological destruction, to actively corrupt his own identity until he could no longer clearly distinguish between what he felt and what he was forced to perform. The other house servants began to notice small changes that accumulated into something profound. Samuel had always been careful about maintaining internal dignity even while performing external deference. He would comply with orders while keeping some essential part of himself separate and untouched. But that separation was collapsing. When Margareta praised him, his face now showed genuine pleasure rather than the careful blankness of someone enduring. When she criticized him, he displayed authentic distress rather than performed contrition. Most disturbing was how Samuel had begun to police his own behavior even when Margareta was not present. He would correct his posture, adjust his expression, modify his speech patterns to match what he believed she expected. The performance had become so continuous, so all-encompassing, that he no longer seemed to have any self that existed outside of it. Ruth, one of the kitchen workers who had known Samuel since they were children, attempted to speak with him in late July during a rare moment when he was alone. She found him in the plantation office reviewing account books, and she asked him quietly how he was truly managing under the circumstances. Samuel looked up from the ledgers with an expression that made Ruth immediately regret asking. There was confusion in his face, as if her question did not make sense. "Managing what circumstances?" he asked. "I am managing the household accounts. I am performing my duties as Margareta's husband." "What other circumstances would you mean?" Ruth realized in that moment that Samuel was not pretending for safety's sake. He genuinely seemed unable to access whatever part of himself had existed before February. The man she had known was gone, replaced by something Margareta had constructed through months of systematic manipulation. The experiment had succeeded in ways that even Margareta might not have fully anticipated. She had not just forced Samuel to perform a role. She had fundamentally rewritten his sense of who he was. The neighboring plantation and the spread of methodology. In August of 1825, something unprecedented occurred. Charlotte Rutledge, a widow from the neighboring Ashford plantation, visited Willowmere to observe Margareta's methods firsthand. Charlotte was 46 years old, recently widowed following her husband's death in a riding accident, and facing similar challenges to those that had confronted Margareta. Debts accumulated through poor management, skeptical family members questioning her competence, and an enslaved population that traditional overseers controlled through brutality that reduced productivity through injury and exhaustion. Unlike most of Charleston society who shunned Margareta for her violations of propriety, Charlotte saw something else entirely. She saw a woman who had achieved extraordinary control over her enslaved population without resorting to the expensive and productivity-reducing brutality that most overseers employed. The enslaved workers at Willowmere moved with efficiency that Charlotte's overseer had never achieved, despite liberal use of the whip. The household ran smoothly. The fields were productive. And at the center of it all was Margareta's system of psychological manipulation. Charlotte spent 3 days at Willowmere, observing how Margareta managed her household, how the enslaved population responded to Samuel's elevated status, how fear and aspiration had been weaponized into tools of control. She watched Samuel perform his role with what appeared to be genuine devotion. She saw how other enslaved workers competed for small privileges and recognition. She understood that Margareta had discovered something profound about human psychology that could be applied beyond the scandal of the fake marriage. Charlotte returned to Ashford Plantation and began implementing her own version of Margareta's system. Not marriage, she was too conscious of social appearances for such overt scandal, but a carefully constructed hierarchy of privileges and psychological manipulations designed to make enslaved workers compete for status and recognition. She identified the most intelligent and capable enslaved man on her property, a 32-year-old named Marcus, who worked as a carpenter, and elevated him to a position of authority over other workers. But Charlotte's elevation came with the same strings Margareta had attached to Samuel's status. Marcus had to demonstrate gratitude publicly. He had to perform devotion to Charlotte's benevolence. He had to enforce her authority among other enslaved workers, and for successful performance, he received privileges that set him apart. Better housing, superior clothing, access to tools and materials that other workers could not touch. Within 2 months, productivity at Ashford increased by 23%. The enslaved population, previously managed through brutal punishment, now worked with desperate intensity to gain Charlotte's favor and avoid her displeasure. The costs were less visible than whip marks, but no less real. Psychological manipulation that made people participate in their own degradation. Charlotte was quietly sharing her methods with other widows and plantation mistresses throughout the Low Country. A contagion of psychological warfare was spreading through Beaufort County, and no one seemed capable of stopping it. Because what Margaretta had discovered, and Charlotte was replicating, appeared to work far more effectively than traditional brutality at extracting maximum productivity from enslaved populations. The letters that were never sent. In the sealed courthouse chamber discovered in 1985, investigators found a bundle of letters written by Samuel between June and October of 1825. 73 pages of careful handwriting that had never been sent, never reached any recipient, but had been discovered among Margaretta's possessions after her death and sealed away by the Van der Horst family descendants, who understood their disturbing implications. The letters were addressed to no one in particular, perhaps to God, perhaps to himself, perhaps to some imagined future where his testimony might matter. They documented his daily existence with painful clarity, the performances he was required to give, the moments when Margaretta's cruelty pierced through the pretense of marriage, his growing inability to remember who he had been before February, before the ceremony that had transformed him from Samuel the enslaved man into Samuel the husband. June 12, 1825. I write these words in darkness when the house sleeps and I am briefly free from performance. Today I called her my dear wife 17 times. 14 times the words felt hollow in my mouth. 3 times I said them without thinking, as if they were true. I do not know which frightens me more. The early entries maintained a clear sense of separation between performance and reality. Samuel documented Margaretta's demands with the detachment of someone recording events happening to another person. He wrote about the privileges she granted and the humiliations she deployed with equal clinical precision. He was clearly attempting to maintain some core sense of self by treating his own experience as something observable rather than something that defined him. July 8, 1825. She requires me to embrace her before the other servants each morning, to speak words of affection as if they are genuine. I have learned to produce the correct expression, the proper tone of voice. The others believe I have forgotten myself. Perhaps they are correct. I perform so constantly that I am no longer certain which parts are performance and which parts have become something else. But by October, that separation had begun to collapse. The handwriting itself changed, becoming less controlled, the words running together as if written in haste or distress. October 3rd, 1825. Today she was ill with headache, and I felt genuine concern. Not performed concern for her benefit. Real worry for her well-being. I brought her tea without being asked. I adjusted the curtains to dim the light without her requesting it, and I felt satisfaction when she thanked me. Felt pride that I had anticipated her needs correctly. What is happening to me? I remember who I was, but that person feels distant, like someone I knew long ago, rather than who I am. The most disturbing entries came near the end of the collection. October 19th, 1825. I tried today to remember my mother's face. I know she existed. I know she died when I was 7, but I cannot see her features clearly anymore. What I see instead is Margaretta's face, her expressions of approval or disappointment. These have become more real to me than memories of my own mother. I am losing myself piece by piece, and I am powerless to stop it. The letters ended abruptly in late October, with no explanation for why Samuel stopped writing them. The Reverend's investigation and the limits of intervention. Reverend Josiah Whitfield, minister of St. Helena's Episcopal Church in Beaufort, had been hearing troubling reports about Willowmere Plantation throughout the summer of 1825. His parishioners spoke in hushed voices about Margaretta's scandalous marriage, about changes in the van der Horst household that violated every principle of Christian order. By September, he felt compelled by pastoral duty to intervene, to speak with Margaretta about the spiritual implications of her behavior. Reverend Whitfield was 58 years old, educated at Princeton, and possessed of the moral certainty that characterized clergy who had spent decades interpreting God's will for plantation society. He had preached countless sermons on the Christian duty of masters to treat their enslaved workers with benevolent paternalism. He believed firmly that slavery was ordained by Scripture but must be exercised with restraint and spiritual responsibility. What he had heard about Margaretta's methods troubled him not because they were cruel. He accepted certain cruelties as necessary for maintaining order, but because they violated the proper boundaries between master and enslaved. He arrived at Willowmere unannounced on a Wednesday afternoon, believing that surprise would prevent Margaretta from preparing elaborate deceptions. But Margaretta received him cordially, as if his visit was expected and welcome. She invited him into her parlor, ordered tea to be served, and positioned Samuel nearby to attend to any needs that might arise during the conversation. The meeting that followed, documented in Reverend Whitfield's private journals discovered after his death in 1847, revealed the fundamental powerlessness of even religious authority when confronted with the absolute control that slave owners wielded within their own properties. When Reverend Whitfield attempted to raise concerns about the impropriety and potential sinfulness of the situation, Margaretta responded with perfect calm and unsettling logic. She challenged him to identify which law or religious doctrine she was violating. The marriage was not legally binding under South Carolina statute, so she had not truly married an enslaved man. She was simply treating Samuel with unusual kindness in exchange for exceptional service. What sin was there in kindness? What law was broken by elevation rather than degradation? Did not Scripture itself command masters to reward faithful servants? Reverend Whitfield attempted to argue that the appearance of impropriety was itself problematic, that her behavior created scandal that reflected poorly on Christian slaveholders. But Margaretta countered that scandal existed only in the minds of those who chose to interpret her benevolence as something sinister. She was elevating a deserving servant, acknowledging his exceptional capabilities, treating him with dignity that recognized his humanity. Was that not closer to Christ's teachings than the brutal indifference most plantation owners displayed? The Reverend found himself intellectually outmaneuvered. Every argument he raised, Margaretta deflected with reasoning that was technically correct, even as it violated the spirit of what he was trying to express. He left Willowmere that afternoon troubled by the realization that Margaretta was operating in a moral void where normal rules simply did not apply. Enslaved people existed in a legal category that placed them beyond the protections of both law and social convention. What happened to them was entirely at their owner's discretion. The breaking point and the unraveling of performance. In November of 1825, during a dinner party that Margaretta hosted for several other plantation widows who had adopted aspects of her methodology, something unexpected occurred. The gathering included Charlotte Rutledge from Ashford, along with two other women who had begun implementing psychological manipulation systems within their own households. The dinner was intended as both social event and opportunity to compare observations about their various experiments in control. Samuel performed his usual role throughout the meal, standing attentively behind Margaretta's chair, anticipating her needs, occasionally joining the conversation when she invited his input on household management questions. The visiting widows watched with fascination, observing how complete his transformation appeared. He spoke with educated diction, unusual for enslaved people. He moved with authority that suggested genuine belief in his elevated status. The performance was flawless. Then, during a discussion about optimal crop rotation patterns, Samuel suddenly stopped mid-sentence. He had been explaining how Willowmere's fields were organized when his voice simply ceased. He stood frozen, staring at his hands with an expression that witnesses later struggled to describe. Not confusion, exactly, but a profound disconnection, as if he had momentarily forgotten where he was or who he was supposed to be. The moment lasted perhaps 10 seconds, though it felt longer to everyone present. The conversation around the table died as the women watched Samuel's face cycle through expressions that revealed something fundamentally broken beneath his careful performance. Confusion gave way to distress to something approaching terror, before his features finally settled back into the composed mask he normally wore. "I apologize," Samuel said quietly, his voice hoarse. "I momentarily lost my train of thought. The fields are organized in 4-year rotation: cotton, then corn, then cotton again, with the 4th year left fallow for soil recovery." He continued his explanation as if nothing had happened, but everyone present had seen it. The mask had slipped. The psychological machinery that Margareta had so carefully constructed was showing signs of catastrophic failure. The performance that had seemed so complete, so naturalized, had revealed itself as performance, and beneath that performance was something damaged beyond simple description. Rather than concern or alarm, Margareta's face showed fascination. She was watching Samuel with the same clinical interest she might direct toward an agricultural experiment producing unexpected but informative results. This was exactly what her methodology was designed to produce. The complete dissolution of Samuel's sense of self, followed by the construction of a new identity built entirely around servitude dressed as devotion. What she had not calculated, what her journal entries had not anticipated, was what would happen after that breaking point was reached, after Samuel no longer had any core self to return to when the performance ended. After the construction she had built in place of his original identity began showing stress fractures that threatened complete collapse. The dinner party continued, but the atmosphere had changed. The visiting widows exchanged glances that suggested they were reconsidering their own implementations of Margareta's methods. They had seen something that troubled even women who had embraced psychological warfare as plantation management tool. The influenza outbreak and the revelation of true feelings. In December of 1825, an influenza outbreak swept through Beaufort County, affecting both enslaved and free populations with democratic cruelty. The disease moved through households regardless of wealth or status, leaving fever, weakness, and death in patterns that physicians could neither predict nor control. By mid-December, 7 enslaved people at Willowmere had fallen ill, along with 2 house servants and Margareta herself. When Margareta fell ill with a severe case that left her bedridden for 3 weeks, the plantation's power structure shifted in ways that exposed uncomfortable truths. Dr. Edmund Crawford visited daily, prescribing the remedies available to 1825 medicine: bleeding, purging, and tinctures that probably did more harm than good. Margareta suffered through fever that reached dangerous levels, delirium that left her confused and helpless, and weakness so profound she could barely lift her head from the pillow. Samuel, freed temporarily from the constant need to perform devotion under Margareta's watchful eye, should have reverted to something closer to his original self. The removal of her controlling presence should have allowed him to drop the mask, to acknowledge even privately that the performance had been forced rather than genuine. Instead, he behaved with what appeared to be authentic concern for her recovery. He sat beside her bed during the worst of the fever, placing cool cloths on her forehead when she burned with heat. He consulted with Dr. Crawford about treatments, asking intelligent questions about the progression of the disease and what measures might speed recovery. He supervised the household with the authority of someone who believed himself to be protecting his wife's interests, rather than simply maintaining the property of his owner. The other enslaved workers watched this with horror that cut deeper than any of Margareta's previous cruelties, because they could see what Margareta's experiment had accomplished. Samuel was no longer performing devotion to avoid punishment or gain privileges. He had internalized the role so completely that he could no longer distinguish it from authentic feeling. The woman who owned him as property had successfully invaded and occupied his very sense of self. Ruth, observing Samuel's behavior during the weeks of Margaretta's illness, felt something approaching grief. She had known Samuel since they were children, playing in the quarters while their parents worked the fields. She remembered the intelligent, dignified man he had been before February, and she watched that man's complete erasure with the understanding that if it could happen to Samuel, it could happen to any of them. When Margaretta finally recovered in early January, weak but alert, Samuel's relief appeared entirely genuine. He brought her broth and bread, adjusted her pillows, read to her from books she enjoyed, and when she thanked him, he smiled with what looked like real happiness. The experiment had exceeded Margaretta's projections. She had not just forced compliance, she had fundamentally rewritten another human being's sense of self. Approximately 500 words each. Segment 16. Margaretta's recovery and the new phase of control. When Margaretta recovered from the influenza in January of 1826, she found herself in possession of something she had not quite expected. Not a husband, certainly not in any legitimate sense, but a person whose identity had become so thoroughly enmeshed with hers that his psychological survival now depended on maintaining their twisted relationship. The realization filled her with scientific satisfaction rather than any human warmth. The journal entry from January 15, 1826, discovered in the sealed courthouse chamber, reads with clinical precision. The experiment has exceeded initial projections. Subject displays authentic rather than performed attachment, verified through behaviors during my illness when supervision was impossible. This suggests that human identity is more plastic than contemporary philosophy acknowledges. Given sufficient time and controlled conditions, one can fundamentally remake another's sense of self. Implications for plantation management are profound. Traditional brutality may be inefficient compared to systematic psychological reconstruction. Margaretta began documenting what she called the maintenance phase of her methodology. Having successfully dismantled Samuel's original identity and constructed a replacement built entirely around servitude and devotion, she now needed to understand the system's durability. How much casual cruelty could she deploy without risking Samuel's psychological collapse? How far could she push him while maintaining the devotion she had so carefully cultivated? The answer, as she discovered over the following months, was far further than she had imagined. Because once a person's identity has been rebuilt around serving another, almost any abuse can be rationalized as necessary discipline rather than cruelty. Samuel had no independent sense of self to defend. His worth existed only in relation to Margaretta's approval. When she criticized him harshly, he did not feel unjustly attacked. He felt he had failed in his purpose. Margaretta began testing the limits systematically. She would praise Samuel elaborately for days, then suddenly withdraw all acknowledgement, treating him with cold indifference. She documented how long he could endure the withdrawal before showing signs of distress. She recorded his responses to different types of humiliation, noting which produced shame that motivated improvement versus despair that reduced functionality. She discovered that intermittent reinforcement, the unpredictable alternation between reward and punishment, created stronger psychological bonds than consistent treatment. Samuel worked hardest when he was uncertain of her favor, desperate to regain approval he could never be confident of maintaining. The system was self-perpetuating once properly established. Other plantation owners were beginning to hear about Margaretta's success through the network of widows who had attended her November dinner party. Productivity at Willowmere remained extraordinarily high despite reduced use of physical punishment. The enslaved population worked with intensity that traditional overseers could not achieve through brutality. And Margaretta was documenting everything, creating a manual for psychological exploitation that could potentially transform plantation management throughout the South. The implications were staggering. If her methods spread, if other slaveholders began implementing systematic identity reconstruction, the nature of slavery itself might fundamentally change. Not more humane, despite the reduction in visible brutality, but more invasive, more complete in its domination of human consciousness. The first imitator's tragedy and the limits of replication. In February of 1826, Charlotte Rutledge's attempt to implement Margaretta's methodology at Ashford Plantation ended in catastrophic failure that sent shockwaves through the network of plantation mistresses who had been quietly adopting aspects of Margaretta's approach. Charlotte had been implementing her system for 5 months, elevating the enslaved carpenter Marcus to a position of authority and privilege similar to what Margaretta had granted Samuel. But unlike Margaretta, who had approached the psychological manipulation with cold precision and careful documentation of responses, Charlotte had tried to replicate the results without fully understanding the mechanisms. She had granted Marcus privileges without establishing the psychological dependence that made those privileges tools of control rather than genuine elevation. She had demanded performances of devotion without the systematic alternation of reward and punishment that broke down resistance to the performance. Marcus had played along with Charlotte's demands, performing gratitude and devotion while maintaining his sense of self intact. He wore the better clothing she provided. He accepted the authority she granted him over other workers, but he never internalized the role the way Samuel had. He remained Marcus, performing a part rather than becoming the part. On February 12, 1826, when Charlotte attempted to humiliate Marcus in front of other enslaved workers as part of what she understood to be Margaretta's methodology, something unexpected happened. Marcus refused the humiliation. He told Charlotte plainly that he would not participate in degradation theater for her entertainment. The refusal was quiet, but absolute. Charlotte, shocked by defiance from someone she believed she had successfully controlled, escalated. She threatened to withdraw all privileges, to return Marcus to field work, to have him whipped for insubordination. Marcus responded with violence that left Charlotte injured with a broken arm and severe bruising. He struck her once, then fled into the night, understanding that his life was forfeit regardless of what happened next. The county patrol captured Marcus within 3 days. Under South Carolina law, physical violence against a white person by an enslaved person carried only 1 sentence. Marcus was hanged on February 18, 1826, in Beaufort's public square, with mandatory attendance by enslaved people from surrounding plantations. The execution was designed as warning and deterrent. But the incident raised uncomfortable questions for the women who had embraced Margaretta's methods. Charlotte had tried to implement the system without understanding its psychological foundations. She had treated psychological manipulation as if it were a simple formula rather than a complex methodology requiring intelligence, patience, and careful calibration. The result had been disaster. Some plantation mistresses abandoned the methodology entirely after Ashford's tragedy, recognizing the danger of attempting psychological warfare they did not fully comprehend. Others became more cautious, implementing smaller-scale versions that avoided overt scandal, while maintaining the underlying principle that control through status manipulation could be more effective than control through brutality. Margaretta noted the failure in her journal with clinical detachment. February 20th, 1826. Charlotte Rutledge's implementation failure demonstrates the methodology's complexity. Simple replication of surface features produces instability rather than control. Subject must be systematically dismantled before reconstruction is possible. Half measures create dangerous illusions of elevation without genuine psychological dependence. The system requires complete commitment and precise execution. Samuel's Decline and the Physical Cost of Psychological Bondage. By summer of 1826, Samuel's health had begun to deteriorate in ways that alarmed even Margaretta. The constant psychological strain of maintaining an identity built entirely around serving someone who owned him as property was manifesting in physical symptoms that 1826 medicine could neither diagnose nor treat effectively. The mind-body connection was poorly understood by contemporary physicians, but the evidence of Samuel's decline was undeniable. Severe insomnia left him exhausted, but unable to rest. He would lie in his second-floor room throughout the night, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with anxieties about whether he was adequately fulfilling his role as Margaretta's husband. Had he anticipated her needs correctly? Had his performance at dinner been sufficiently convincing? Had he made errors that would result in withdrawal of her favor? The questions circled endlessly, preventing the sleep his body desperately needed. His weight dropped dramatically despite adequate food. The plantation cook, an older woman named Hester, noticed that Samuel barely touched the meals she prepared for the main house. When she asked if something was wrong with her cooking, Samuel assured her the food was excellent. He simply could not seem to eat more than a few bites before his stomach rebelled. The anxiety had become so constant that his body had forgotten how to process nourishment normally. He developed a tremor in his hands that appeared during moments of stress, which meant it appeared almost constantly. The shaking was subtle but visible when he tried to write in the plantation ledgers or pour Margaretta's tea. He would press his hands against his thighs to still them, but the tremor would return moments later, a physical manifestation of psychological collapse. The plantation physician, Dr. Clement Morrison, examining Samuel in July of 1826, noted in his records that the patient displayed symptoms consistent with what contemporary medicine might recognize as severe chronic anxiety and depression, though 1826 medicine had no such vocabulary. Dr. Morrison recorded nervous prostration and melancholic constitution, attributing Samuel's condition to unknown internal weaknesses rather than understanding the psychological causes. Dr. Morrison attempted to discuss his concerns with Margaretta, suggesting that perhaps the unusual living arrangements should be reconsidered for the sake of Samuel's health. He recommended that Samuel be returned to less stressful duties, that the demands placed upon him might be exceeding his constitutional capacity to endure them. The physician spoke carefully, unwilling to directly criticize how Margaretta managed her property, but hoping to appeal to her self-interest. A valuable enslaved worker destroyed through overwork represented financial loss. Margaretta's response, preserved in Dr. Morrison's journal, was chilling in its honesty. His discomfort is unfortunate, but secondary to the demonstration's completion. I must understand the full arc of what my methods produce, including their limitations and endpoints. If the system has natural limits, I need to document where those limits occur. This is valuable information that cannot be obtained without complete observation. She was not going to end the experiment. She was going to document Samuel's decline with the same clinical precision she had documented his transformation. The physical cost of psychological bondage was simply another data point in her study of human plasticity under conditions of total control. The discovery by Preston van der Horst and the family's intervention. In August of 1826, Preston van der Horst, Hendrik's younger brother and Margaretta's brother-in-law, received disturbing reports about conditions at Willowmere from a business associate in Charleston who had heard rumors circulating through merchant circles. Preston had largely ignored Margaretta following Hendrik's death, content to let her manage the plantation while he pursued merchant interests in Charleston. He had dismissed early reports of her scandalous marriage as exaggerated gossip from neighbors who resented a woman's success in plantation management. But by August, the reports had become too detailed and too consistent to ignore. Preston's business associate described whispers about psychological torture masquerading as kindness, about an enslaved man whose mind had been systematically destroyed, about methods spreading to other plantations with unpredictable results. The associate suggested that the van der Horst family name was being associated with practices that threatened to create broader social instability. Preston was 51 years old, pragmatic rather than cruel, and primarily concerned with maintaining the family's reputation and financial interests. He arrived at Willowmere unannounced in mid-August, intending to assess the situation and determine whether intervention was necessary. What he witnessed during his week-long stay convinced him that Margareta had moved beyond eccentric cruelty into something that threatened not just family reputation, but potentially the broader social order. He observed Samuel's transformation firsthand, the hollow-eyed devotion of a person whose self had been systematically dismantled and reconstructed around servitude. He watched Samuel interact with Margareta with what appeared to be genuine affection rather than performed obedience. He saw the tremor in Samuel's hands, the weight loss, the exhaustion that no amount of sleep seemed to remedy. Most disturbing, he saw Samuel's complete inability to conceptualize himself as separate from his role as Margareta's husband. During a private conversation on the veranda, Preston asked Samuel directly whether he was being treated well, whether he needed anything, offering implicit opportunity to request relief from his situation. Samuel looked confused by the question. "Treated well. I am treated as Margareta's husband. I have privileges beyond what any enslaved person could expect. I have her favor and recognition. What more could I need?" The response was delivered with apparent sincerity that revealed complete psychological capture. Preston also discovered Margareta's journal, which she had carelessly left accessible in her writing desk. He read enough entries to understand that what he was witnessing was not spontaneous cruelty, but systematic experimentation. Margareta had approached the destruction of another person's identity with scientific precision, documenting her methods with the goal of potentially replicating them on larger scales. He recognized that if her methods spread unchecked, if other plantation owners began implementing similar systematic psychological warfare, the consequences could be catastrophic. Not because it was morally wrong, Preston's ethical framework was deeply compromised by his participation in the slavery system, but because it was destabilizing. It created a new kind of relationship between enslaver and enslaved that might ultimately prove more dangerous than traditional brutal distance. Enslaved people who believed themselves elevated might eventually realize they had been deceived, producing resistance more organized and more dangerous than individual acts of defiance. Preston decided that intervention was necessary, not for Samuel's sake, but to protect the Van der Horst family interests and broader social stability. The collapse, the cover-up, and the sealed chamber. In September of 1826, Samuel disappeared from Willowmere Plantation. The official story, recorded in estate ledgers and local records, was that he had died from complications of influenza that had never fully resolved after the December outbreak. Dr. Morrison signed a death certificate citing respiratory failure secondary to chronic disease. A burial was recorded in the Plantation Cemetery, a segregated corner of the grounds where enslaved people were interred with wooden markers that rarely bore names. But documents found in the sealed courthouse chamber in 1985 suggest a very different conclusion. Samuel had not died of disease. He had reached a state of complete psychological collapse, a dissociative break so profound that he could no longer function in any capacity. He had been found in his room one morning in early September, unresponsive but breathing, his eyes open but empty of recognition or awareness. When spoken to, he did not reply. When offered food, he did not eat. He had retreated so far into himself that no external stimulus could reach him. Dr. Morrison, examining Samuel in this state, wrote privately that he had seen similar conditions among soldiers who had witnessed particularly horrifying battles, a state where the mind simply refused to process reality any further. But he had never seen it produced through the psychological mechanisms Margareta had employed. The complete dismantling of identity followed by attempted reconstruction had created damage beyond any capacity to repair. Preston Van der Horst, recognizing the scandal this would create if it became public, arranged for Samuel to be quietly transferred to a remote farm property in upcountry South Carolina, far from Beaufort County's scrutiny. The property was managed by an elderly couple who owed the van der Horst family significant debts. They agreed to house Samuel and provide basic care in exchange for debt forgiveness and ongoing financial support. Samuel would spend the remaining decades of his life in that remote location, in a state of detachment so complete that witnesses described him as absent even when present. He required assistance with basic tasks like eating and dressing. He did not speak except in rare moments when he would whisper "Margareta" or fragments of phrases from his performance as her husband. The man who had been Samuel was gone, destroyed by an experiment in psychological control that had succeeded too completely. The true horror of what Margareta had accomplished was not that she had been cruel. Cruelty was commonplace in the machinery of slavery. The horror was that she had discovered a methodology so effective at dismantling human identity that it produced results more complete and more permanent than any physical torture. And she had documented it with scientific precision in her journal, creating a blueprint that could potentially be replicated by others with similar, ruthless intelligence. Preston van der Horst sealed the journal, along with Samuel's letters and other evidence of the experiment, in a chamber behind the courthouse wall. He could not destroy the documents without creating questions about what he was hiding, but he could ensure they remained hidden. The chamber was constructed during courthouse renovations in 1827, built into a space between walls where it would be invisible to casual inspection, until 1985, when renovation workers opened the wall and exposed the truth that the van der Horst family had spent 160 years trying to bury. The documents revealed a story of systematic psychological warfare more disturbing than physical brutality, because it invaded the very core of human identity, proving that under conditions of total control, a person could be unmade and remade into something their creator designed, at a cost that measured not in scars but in the complete erasure of self.